Hello and welcome to this video in which I am I'm trying to deal with a question that comes up in debates between political leaders. We're in the election season, and particularly in the United Kingdom. And we're in a couple of, maybe just a couple of weeks' time or 3 weeks' time, July the 4th. American Independence Day, we've got an election here in the UK, and of course the European Union has had election. In the United States there's elections, and one of the key questions that gets asked is how you're going to pay for your program, what you're wanting to do. It gets asked of all the different political parties. So I thought I would enter into the fray with an explanation of how modern money works in a government, or a nation, I should say, that has monetary sovereignty. And I'm going to be explaining what that means in this video, because it has quite a big impact on how we understand and maybe the choices that we're going to make too in the election. Now, I'm living in Scotland, so this has a slight bias, if you like, or a slant towards the interests of those of us who live in Scotland, where the question of independence is still hotly debated, and there are a few parties that are particularly pro-independence and other parties that are not for it at all. But I want to see how that question is impacted by understanding how modern money works. So I will let you watch this video, and I will do a few very brief concluding comments at the end. The question that is put to politicians in election debates, particularly here in the UK, but probably elsewhere, is how are you going to pay for what you propose to do? We are all in difficult economic times throughout the world. And of course, there is an assumption that in order to pay for what they promise to do, often very generous promises, they've either got to increase their taxes in some way or other, so increase their income, or reduce their spending in other parts of the economy or other parts of the program, and therefore deliver what is basically an austerity type of program. And of course, this has been the case in the UK for some years now. But actually, the point I want to make in this video is it's the wrong question. We are all familiar with the fact that whether it is a household or a business, you have to balance your income and expenditure. Deficits are worrying and debts have to be repaid. And especially, you've got to take care that you are able to repay what you borrow, even if it is over a period of time. And the assumption is that governments operate in the same way. A government has to balance its budget, when in fact governments that have monetary sovereignty do not have to balance their budget. And let me explain. A national government that has monetary sovereignty is a government that, well, a nation rather, that has its own bank, and that bank issues its own currency, which in the United Kingdom is a pound. And because it can issue its own currency, it is known technically as a fiat currency, one that you make yourself. And so basically, national governments that have monetary sovereignty can never run out of the money it needs, and deficits are not a problem. In the way that most politicians seem to be answering that question in the election debates that I've watched so far, it seems that they are still thinking of the UK as a household, and therefore that the government has to balance its budget, and therefore deficits are worrying. And of course, certainly when you speak to people in the street and they are asked about the questions of the manifestos and what each party is proposing, they are also thinking along these lines and making the same assumptions. But here is a secret. And this is a quote from Paul Samuelson. He's an American economist, and I think I heard this via Randall Wray, another economist, quoting him, "Shh, can you keep a secret? The necessity of balancing the budget is that old-time religion we use to scare politicians and the population to behave themselves." We being the economists. So let's look at how modern money works in nations that have monetary sovereignty. Now, previously, obviously, the value of the currency was tied to the value of gold. But when I think it was 1971, President Nixon decoupled the value of the dollar from the gold standard and then floated the currency in the world currency market so that people began to trade openly in that. It then set in motion a whole lot of other nations that followed suit. So the pound is also a free floating currency, not tied and linked to the value of the gold standard. And nations that are even their value is sometimes linked to the dollar as being a major currency in the world. But anyway, the whole point is that creating money in a modern fiat currency is a bit like adding scores to a scoreboard. You can run out of innings, you can run out of time in cricket that I'm talking about, but you cannot run out of runs or points in any other kind of sport. So the central bank doesn't actually print money. Money is simply created by clicks on the keyboard of a computer. That, of course, is how the British government and many other governments around the world could support their people and businesses when the COVID pandemic hit us. That money wasn't borrowed, it was created. So that's why we were able to support the National Health Service, and we was able to support families that had no income coming into them, the furloughing scheme, and support businesses that had no income coming into them. So how does a government with its own currency spend money? Well, basically, the central bank receives and makes payments on behalf of the Treasury, and the Treasury, of course, is under the instructions from the government, and so it will be based on fiscal policy, what they are doing and how they're planning to use their money. And so the money flows, if you like, through from the Bank of England. The Bank of England may have to create money. It doesn't have, and if it's got money, then it doesn't have to create it. But it flows through the Bank of England to the bank accounts of all the individuals and companies that need that money or get grants or are supported in any way. Now, the devolved governments in the United Kingdom, that is the governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland that have a degree of autonomy, and they have what they are called devolved matters that they can have a certain amount of control over. Nevertheless, all of these nations have to balance their budgets. In the same way, I believe that in the United States, the states have received money from the federal government and then they have to balance. I don't know if they can raise their own taxes. They probably can in some way. I don't know. But also in Europe, the devolved governments in the Eurozone, there's a certain amount of limitation of freedom when you are actually not the one that has monetary sovereignty. So in Europe, it will be the European Parliament or the European government that, as it were, has the European Central Bank. Be that as it may, as far as the UK is concerned, it's a very, very important, and it's an important issue when it comes to this current election, where the question of independence is being very much in the forefront of the debate in Scotland. So yes, they have to balance their budgets because they receive a fixed amount of money from the Bank of England, from the Bank of England, and it's worked out on the basis of a certain formula called the Barnett formula to try and make it fair for each of the devolved governments. But it nevertheless means that you have a pot of money and that is what you can't have any more than what you're given by Westminster. And I believe the Scottish government does have a tiny bit of wriggle room in that it can have raise some of its own taxes, but not much. Anyway, the point is that even if they can raise taxes, they can run out of the money that they need. And so it is a worrying situation for the Scottish government. Scotland is a user of the currency and not the issuer of the currency. That means it has to balance its budget in the same way as a business or home has to balance its budget. And I've just illustrated this particularly for Scotland, but it would be applying for all the other devolved area governments as well, where the government therefore has this pot of money, and the Scottish government that is, and it can therefore distribute that amongst the different departments that are responsible for the areas of policy that are devolved matters, like the National Health Service in Scotland, Scottish Social Services, and the Education Department, Transport, and Scottish councils therefore also receive a bit of the pot. And the Scottish Council have to function in the same way. Here we come to another crucial point. When the Westminster government spends more than it receives in taxes, it makes a financial contribution to some other aspect of the economy. Now, the graph that I've shown is actually, I believe, taken from statistics in the United States, because I couldn't find a simple graph to show the same point for the UK. But what you see is that you've got the red line is the government sector balance, and the blue line is the non-government sector balance, and notice how they mirror each other. In other words, a government deficit means a non-government surplus. The money is moved simply by paying for stuff that the government wants to do. It shifts that money into the non-government sector. Now, here's what Stephanie Kelton, author of The Deficit Myth, said in a TED talk. Every government deficit is good for someone. The question is for whom? And what are those deficits being used to accomplish? Tax cuts with huge windfalls for those at the top, without sparking investment and opportunity for the rest of the population, don't make good use of deficits. So the real question that politicians should be asking is not what can we afford to do, but what do the British people need us to do so that we can all feel better off and live healthy lives with a reasonable degree of financial social security. But does that mean that a nation with monetary sovereignty can spend without limit? No, there are definitely limits, but the limits are not money, they are resources. So here in this slide we have the resources of a nation, just simply depicted in symbolic form. So you've got knowledge resources, you've got personnel resources, you've got skills resources, you've got natural resources, you've got agricultural resources, etc. But also you have an unused resource, and that is the jobless, those who are who are not employed or only partly employed. Or maybe there are people who are inadequately educated and not adequately trained for the jobs that need doing. So basically what happens then is that the output of the nation is less than it is full capacity. The output in terms of gross domestic product, which is the way it is often presented. So in this illustration I've said supposing the output is at 80% of capacity. The real restraint on government spending is not how much it has, but how much spare productive capacity does the nation have in its economy. What therefore is the gap between what the nation is producing and what it is capable of producing? That means that instead of aiming to balance the budget, governments with fiat currencies should be aiming to balance the economy. That is, aiming at full employment and stable pricing. Now, to accomplish that, they need to invest in making sure that people can be fully employed, have the skills that are required for the jobs that are needed, and also that the material or the resources of the nation are fully used. And then, of course, the whole matter of stable pricing has to do with something else that we'll also be dealing with shortly. Our government can certainly create money for what the British people need, which is housing, healthcare, social security, etc. And they can create jobs for people so long as there are people who need employment. So instead of just aiming for a balanced economy, the government needs to aim for a balanced well-being economy. And that is not going to be measured in terms of GDP, but GDW, gross domestic well-being. And all of the different aspects of well-being are well illustrated in this wonderful diagram here, whether it is to do with medical care, casework, health, love, trust, meaningful work, fairness, community trusts, community banks, community involvement, clean water, all sorts of things, including transport, oh yes, and even democracy itself. We need a complete change in the democratic structures of our society and the way we actually elect people, which is why I am fully supportive of full proportional representation as the only fair way of doing things. So if we are to aim at balanced economy with full employment and stable pricing, we therefore have to see what about the other side of the balance, the stable pricing. What is it that causes inflation? And it is inflation, not deficits, that is evident of government overspending. So what happens when you've got full employment is that there's no spare productive capacity in the economy. And when the government therefore wants to demands more of its resources than a nation can supply, then the price of goods and labour goes up. That just simply follows the law that prices will depend on the balance between demand and supply. So in this situation, the government is pushing the economy beyond what it can actually do, and that pushes the prices up. There is also the supply side, which we'll come to later, which also can push the price up. And that is sometimes something that the government doesn't always have control over. So here we see a graph of inflation since the pandemic, and we're all aware of the fact that inflation increased. It wasn't just in the UK, but in the US and Europe as well. But the inflation that followed the pandemic was not, as commonly supposed, caused by an increase in demand, but by a shortage in supply of goods. And in fact, this is usually the case whenever there's been inflation. It's largely a supply side problem, and therefore increasing interest rates to slow down demand may not necessarily be the right way to go about things. Because it has been shown that increasing interest doesn't necessarily change the spending habits of people so much, because they're spending on essentials anyway. So let's look at what happened after, well, starting from before the pandemic. Already there was an upward pressure on inflation because of Brexit. And of course, Brexit was I think, came into full force in 1920 or so. Was it 21? I can't remember. But anyway, that resulted in an increase in prices of goods imported from Europe for a start. It led to the fact that many people who were working in the country left to go back to their country. So we had a shortage in personnel supply, particularly in some areas like care work and the National Health Service. Then there was also a chronic shortage of housing, because there have been a lack of investment in social housing and affordable housing caused by policies of governments for the last number of years. And then to cap it all, of course, we had the Ukraine war and what that did to the oil prices. as well as some food prices as well, the grain prices going up. So here, Professor Randall Wray, who I heard talk on a talk to Cambridge University, I think presumably economic department, he said that hiking rates is the wrong medicine. There is indeed a need to ramp up investment, increase domestic capacity, and replace long, fragile supply chains. And that's what you need to therefore invest in. And to do that, you may need to create money in order to have the means to be able to invest in stuff which actually is short. There's a shortage of supply. But what about taxes? If we can create money and enough money, why do we need to be paying tax at all? We've been led to believe that governments need us to pay our taxes in order to spend money on its programs, and it doesn't appear now to be the case. Well, it was the case when our currency was backed by the value of gold and silver. In that case, we needed to tax and then spend, but that's not the case today with fiat currencies. Well, here's firstly, when we're required by law to pay our taxes in the government-backed currency, it means that we will be happy to be paid either by the government or others in that currency so that we have the money we need to pay our taxes. And actually also taxes encourage us to participate in the UK economy. Secondly, rather than paying for what the government wants to spend, taxes are simply a means of managing the economy in a way that maintains it in a healthy state. So whenever a government creates money, it puts money into the economy, and whenever it taxes people or businesses, it takes money out of the economy. A budget deficit simply means that the government is spending more than it receives in taxes. And so I've got that scale tipping to the right, where the spend is more than the tax. So that means that the net result is that the money is injected into the economy. And then in the budget surplus situation, what happens is that if the tax is more than they actually spend, which is what the budget surplus is, they'll be withdrawing money from the economy. So a budget deficit boosts the economy and reduces unemployment. Conversely, when inflation is rising, a budget surplus will reduce the money supply and hence inflation. So in conclusion, rather than paying for what the government wants to spend, taxes are simply a means of managing the economy in a way that maintains it in a healthy state. Finally, of course, there's a more obvious point that taxes are an important way for governments to alter the distribution of wealth so that we live in a more equal society. And it has been shown time and time again, nations in which the gap between the rich and the poor is narrow have healthier, all the population have healthier, happier lives. All can flourish and thrive, each in their own way. But to do this effectively, we need not just income tax, but also a wealth tax, which there are some parties proposing. Why then does the government need to borrow? The answer is it doesn't. It actually chooses to offer people a different kind of government money, one that pays a bit of interest. So what we call government borrowing is nothing more than the British Treasury allowing people to transform ordinary money, their savings, into interest-bearing money known as a government bond or a fixed interest security. In the UK, they're called gilts because in the past, the paper certificates issued with fixed interest securities had a gilt edge. Now, the investors could be individuals or it could be companies. And indeed, it could even be nations that want to invest in the British pound, which I'll come to in the next slide. Now, in the original diagram, which I've taken and put here, it said that the person or the company was lending the government £1,000 in this particular illustration. In point of fact, these people are not lending money to the government. What they're doing is purchasing a treasury gilt. So unlike a household, the government spends first, supplying the money that can then be used to buy government bonds. And as we saw earlier, it does this to support interest rates, not to fund expenditures. And there are nations that are trading with Britain that will choose to invest in the British pound too. So let me illustrate this just from one example. From what I've understood, I've discovered that in 2023 last year, the UK had a 39 billion trade deficit with China. And that meant simply that people in Britain were buying goods from China far more than China was buying goods from Britain, goods or services from Britain. And so what people do is they pay for those Chinese goods in pounds. China then has pounds to either save or spend in some way, or they could return some to their own money, transfer it back. However, what nations often do, is that the government therefore has money available for both individuals, businesses, and nations indeed to purchase these gilts. So China will therefore purchase these gilts, which therefore will yield some interest rather than simply keeping them in a bank account. But they want to keep that money in UK pounds. So basically, when the government borrows money, it doesn't actually borrow it, and it doesn't owe any nation anything. It is simply a way of allowing people to invest in the British pound. And ultimately, that process benefits the UK economy as well. So what should we be asking the government to do? And instead of the government focusing on its budget deficit, and of course we people were the people asking questions about the budget deficit and how we're going to pay for everything, it should actually be on the real deficits that matter. Now there are deficits in healthcare of the nation, with too few medically qualified personnel, too few qualified care workers to care for the elderly and chronically ill. There's a deficit in hospitals and clinics that are fit for purpose in the 21st century. There's a deficit in updating our infrastructure, especially of rail and road. And I don't mean HS2, which is not updating it, it's just adding something new. There's a deficit in housing, both social housing and in affordable housing, and in the housing that will be more eco-friendly. There's a deficit, therefore, in creating jobs and development projects that will help us to transition away from dependence on fossil fuels and green our economy. So all of these are real deficits. So in conclusion, I couldn't better a summary of the situation that Stephanie Kelton said at the end of her TED talk. I can't remember when that was. It was 2022, I think, or 23. But anyway, she said, with a better understanding of public money, where it comes from and how it works, we can take aim at the real deficits that are bearing down on us. We can't let words like debt and deficit hold us back. In every crisis lies an opportunity. We have the resources we need to repair our broken systems, but we have to believe it is possible. We can pick up the pieces and try and reassemble the fragile systems that were in place before the pandemic, or we can build anew, shaping our bountiful resources into the kind of world we want to live in, one that cares for our people and our planet. I truly hope we choose to be bold. So now we come to the thorny question of Scottish independence, and why is it that there's actually quite a high percentage of Scottish people leaning towards independence? And the reason, there are many, many reasons for it actually, but the point I want to stress here is that if Scotland were to become an independent nation with monetary sovereignty, therefore having its own national bank and also being able to create money in the way that I've described, having its fiat currency, it would then be able to make the bold decisions that Stephanie Kelton is encouraging all nations to make in order to shape our beautiful, bountiful resources that we have plenty of in this Scotland into the kind of world we want to live in, one that cares for people and our planet, a well-being economy. So no wonder over 50% of the people of Scotland are actually leaning towards independence, and that percentage is gradually rising. And if you believe that Scotland has insufficient resources to be an independent nation, then perhaps you should read this. It's a book called Scotland the Brief, produced by Business in Scotland, I think. And this book explodes the myth of Scotland being too poor to stand on its own, and also exposes why the British state fears to lose Scotland. Well, in conclusion, I want to make it clear that this isn't a party political broadcast. I do support the idea of Scotland becoming an independent nation. And the reasons for that have obviously, some of them at least, have become clear in this video. There are many other reasons to do with history and cultural identity and other stuff. But in the context of this election, of course, there are people from a number of different parties, or who would vote for different parties, who actually support the idea of Scotland becoming an independent nation. You don't have to be a member of SNP, as indeed I am not, to support independence. And indeed, there are people within Labour and maybe even the Scottish Liberal Democrats, because I used to be one of them too, that support the idea of independence ultimately. There may be some disagreement about the route to that or the timing of it. I know that people will be saying in this election, well, yes, the Scottish government have got lots of things wrong. And I think they would be the first to admit that they have got things wrong as well. And I'm not going to enumerate the areas in which that has become part of the public debate. But on the other hand, I'm also equally convinced that the argument about the economic argument for Scotland is strong. And because we still are functioning for the general elections in the UK as a first past the post system, which therefore means that there has to be a tactical voting, which is why I will be doing a tactical vote where I am, because I don't think that the current Westminster government, the Conservative government, and I don't actually believe that the Labour government will be inclined towards the things I've been talking about, although there may be some understanding concerning what these matters by, I think, the shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, or the person who might become the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the next government, because there is an awareness that they need to invest in the economy of the country and make jobs and all the rest of it. So I'm going to leave it at that, and hope that you will have been at least illuminated by this video. Thank you.